Our second lecture of this module, which will happen a couple times maybe during this course, is very important to our study. We're going to look at what it means to be male, female, gay, straight, all the things that kind of come on with that spectrum. And so the first thing I want to make sure that you watch before you start this lecture is to go and look at the gender and sexuality spectrum video in Module 2. You can stop the lecture now and go watch it if you haven't. I think it helps to find many categories in a very quick way, but it also helps us understand that there are so many ways in which we express ourselves that even this video itself hasn't gotten to. So let's know the difference between gender and sex. You may have heard this in other classes that you may have taken. Gender refers to a person's non-biological and non-physiological attributes. I often tell people gender is like trying something on, like a t-shirt or something, to see if it fits. And it's a sense of our masculinities and femininities and all the different ways in between. Maybe we don't want to identify as a binary end of the gender spectrum, and we may see ourselves in different lights without a gender. And so one thing that we have to recognize about our body and our expression of ourselves is that sex and gender are different. Sex is a designation of a category based on a binary of male or female. Once again, however, this is a category that we know that there are people that are intersex, that there are people that have been born with both male and female chromosomes and also body parts that have been interchanged. This is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. There is a paper that I've put at the end that I want you to make sure it's a file in this course to look back over and see the biological and the gendering designations again before you do your threading this week. The thing about sex, I often lift up, I have a sister that was born XXY, and she had one extra chromosome. She identified or was identified by parents as female. She presented as female, but we know that she had a Y chromosome. And so it's important for us to recognize that even though we have these binaries, often think of masculinity, femininity, or male, female, that really our bodies have so much more going on, as well as our own idea of what that personality we have inside needs to be and how it is expressed. So today or tonight, depending on when you're listening to this, we're going to focus on two aspects: gender identity in the spectrum. Like I said, watch that video and we'll keep talking about some aspects of that. And also sexual activity, how we use our bodies, what we do with our bodies. And so sexual identity itself is a sense of attractedness with your body practice and how you identify in it, or whether or not sex or sexual attraction is part of your life. Asexuality might mean that a person is not wanting to necessarily have that sexual attraction, or they don't feel it. Yet they still may have romantic partners, or they may even be married. Sexual identity is something that isn't something you can put in a box. There's heteronormative that is often lifted out there between male and female bodies. But as we see, there's bisexuality, homosexuality, and there's pansexuality, all kinds of different forms in which our bodies express that intimacy. We also have intimacy with ourselves. Masturbation is important in understanding that we try to understand our own body sometimes by sexually stimulating it. And from a very young age, many young people, including 2-year-olds, play with themselves. It feels good sometimes. And young bodies of adolescents often find themselves, in the bathroom. And this isn't something that's just limited to one sex. This is how our bodies sometimes are a part of who we are. And we are often shamed based on how society may look at masturbation. And I often tell people masturbation doesn't cause pregnancy. And so there's a lot of times I will ask a parent if they're really concerned what would you rather have, them experimenting more sexually and not protecting themselves, or masturbating? And sometimes that's an important thing to ask ourselves. It's a safe way to have sex, but it's also a way to recognize that we have a body and not be so ashamed by it. In fact, in a study, it was a simple study, but I found the statistic that I think was run through 2 or 3 pharmaceutical companies, was that the percent of men who admitted to masturbating in the study was 95%, and the percentage of women, which they asked as many women, admitted was 89%. Percentage of married men in that study said 70%. Percentage of married women who admitted to masturbating was 70%. So obviously when you get married, you have maybe less masturbating. Obviously it's still there, but it's also at equal rates based on that study. But the other thing I often throw out there is, we think that, masturbating, nobody talks about it, nobody does it. The number of Americans masturbating at any given time is 797,151, and that's at any time. So recognize that that's not all teenagers. We don't have that many teenagers in the world. It is something that all levels of life in adults and young people do. Also, when we talk about our own sexuality and our bodies, a lot of times people wonder, what is the right number of what causes promiscuity, or what we call promiscuous. This is an interesting online survey done in 2017 with 2,000 participants from both the US and Europe. And it was interesting at the number of sexual partners. You think a person becomes too promiscuous. The females said 15.2, and the males said 14. What do you think the ideal number of sexual partners for a person has in a lifetime? About the same. People thought at least 7. It's not, a sense of virginity at marriage that had been the overarching ideas that have happened in the past. Although, once again, if that's what a person chooses, that's who they are. So we're going to respect that. What number of sexual partners do you think a person is too sexually conservative? That was an interesting question, I think. And people said basically 2 to 3. And with how many partners have you engaged in sexual intercourse? Males and females, pretty close there, 6.4 and 7. And so this helps us to recognize, you might find yourself in that spectrum. This also is another average per country, and you can take time to look at this, but it's interesting. In France, the average is 16, but you can look at, what number of sexual partners do you think a person is too sexually conservative, males, females, all being asked at this one. So obviously Netherlands is a little bit more conservative. United States, we find ourselves around here at 15. And then it's 16, not too far off in France. Sex is not required for an intimate relationship. I want you to know that when people choose to engage in sexual activity, there are many forms and practices. Sex is not just sexual intercourse, and that is a very important thing. People will say, I had sex last night. And, it's like, well, what kind? Did you have sexual intercourse? Any type of intimacy, whether it's oral, cunnilingus, fellatio, these are things that we have to recognize are something of our own expression. And there's lots of ways in which sexual activity is not just about involving penetration. So oral sex is that stimulation of the genitals. I just realized I spelled cunnilingus wrong, so sorry about that. I'm not going to change it because I'm recording right now, but I'll change it in the slides. The oral stimulation of a woman's genitals from her partner, and then fellatio is the oral stimulation of a man's genitals from his partner. This is sex. This has different forms of being able to be safe with that. I also invite you to look at one of the videos. I'm not sure if it's in this module, how to talk about an STD, because we have to be tested in this day and age, and it's important to remind ourselves to be safe. And that goes with this next slide. As we are a bodied, practiced people who are figuring out intimate relationships, hooking up has become a part of our culture. I remember the first time I used the phrase was around 2002 or three, and I didn't even think of it as, I don't even think I knew what it meant, and I was in my 30s. So, but it's not just something that has happened in the past and is going to go away. No, it's an expected way of people interacting without commitment or affection for one another, especially as we stretch adolescence through expecting more education and or training on job. People getting married at the average age of 28 in the United States. You can have hookups that are okay, healthy wise, as far as, if you're in a good mental place for that. And also if these three things are absolutely happening. And I think that as we talk about the experiences of intimacy, if people are not looking for deep intimacy, but they're looking for sexual gratification, then consent is important. Both need to be sober, able and willing to participate in that sexual activity. And if either person is under the influence, then I would say that wouldn't be advised. Sexual safety, make sure to use condoms, birth control, refrain from intercourse if both are not present. Make sure that, dental dams or condoms, all of those things are fresh and ready because they do have dates on the packages. And the importance of checking in. It's important that even if somebody has consented, all things are in play. No means no at any time from both sets of the partners. And it's important, as we keep sexual interactions healthy, that people have that ability to check in and say they are not comfortable at that point. I would also invite you to look at sexting. It's an interesting subject. It's also a way that you cannot get pregnant. And we're seeing more and more people sext. And so please take time to look at that video. I think it's important, and it's an interesting way in which people are involved in sexual activity, but it's something that also you have to be careful with. So as we talk about these bodied influences, one thing that is gendered is that males and females tend to still have double standards. The idea that men have been allowed far more permissiveness in sexual behavior than women. And that tends to be something that still is involved in life and society today, that if a female decides to be highly sexually active, she is often deemed a slut, whereas a male is just a boy being a boy. That's, it's like, guys will be guys, boys will be boys, men will be men. This is something that I've invited people, and some people have done some really good final projects on. This double standard is also bracketed by the idea that heterosexual relationships and sexual orientation, rather than considering the vast sexual and gender spectrum, meaning it's based on this male-femaleness. And so there's a lot of times where the feminized experience of life, if somebody expresses them that way, that they're caught into that double standard, that people get caught into these double standards because it's the masculine thing to do, to hook up. Watch the video on double standards in Module 2. Once again, it's a little bit more of a light video, but I think it explains the situation well. Furthermore, as I said earlier, many cultures around the world who recognize the need to count a third sex, even though this may not completely record the sexuality and gender spectrum, is becoming highly important. In fact, this is something that we don't have in the United States. This often goes with how people might identify gender-wise or sex-wise, and it depends on the country and the origins of the policies. For example, in Kenya, there's a high population, I think it's almost 1 million people who have some sort of biological third sex identification, meaning they have both genitalia. And there's a high push to involve that third sex or intersex person into identification on the census. But also in that community is LGBTQ plus community, kind of on that same, trying to have ways in which people can identify other than just male or female. Once again, watch the video in Module 2. The process of identifying and living into your identity is a process, and it's not always all at once. If you watch about the process of identity in Module 2, it talks about two women who looked at the world of lesbians across the world and gay people across the world in that process of identity, and how people culturally have had to experience that. And so I know I have a high, heavy video load this time. Module 2 is always a little heavier getting into the whole process, and then it eases off again. But please watch all these videos. I think they will enlighten you. Are there differences between LGBT or GLBT or however a group identifies? There's so many different, ways in which we can do that. I usually say LGBTQ plus. Are they different than heterosexual relationships? And yes, we are seeing currently that comparing homosexual relationships or bisexual relationships or same-sex partner relationships, that there is a sense of commitment and monogamy that is happening at a higher rate than heterosexual relationships at this time. Of course, there are less people who identify at this point in that category, so the sheer number might make some difference on that. We're too early in actually being able to fully know the data, but I'm interested in this next census to see if we see some things that present. Differences are minimal. They're healthy and healthy relationships. Healthy and unhealthy relationships happen in all types of relationships. Some differences do tend to show up, though. There are, in LGBTQ communities, more stable relationships often than heterosexual couples when concerning these areas. We see people who are same-sex relationships or bisexual relationships share chores more, they share child rearing more, they're more intimate, and they're more satisfied based on surveys at this point. Gay men tend to be more emotionally expressive, less likely to adhere to traditional gender roles, is something that we see happening in all types of homosexual relationships or people who are same-sex genders or same-sex relationships, sorry. We also tend to see a better educated group, and they tend to have more egalitarian households. And early in marriage, gay men have more sex than heterosexual couples, and women have less than heterosexual relationships. So we see that same-sex women have less sex, same-sex men have more sex. That's where we're at with that. The whole point is that we are in charge of that experience of understanding who we are and how we want to identify. When we say sexual identity and gender identity, I agree, it's a bodied experience. It's also physical and mental. It's an embodiment of ourselves as we present who we are to the world. As we talk about differences and similarities of sex and gender and recognize masculinity and femininity, you need to look at how that can be looked through the lens of evolutionary, social learning, nature versus nurture theories, all the different kinds of things that we are studying in theory. For example, in evolutionary theory, we often look at the masculinities and femininities based on primary and secondary characteristics of our bodies. Once again, remember that theory is about trying to procreate and create children a lot of the time, and as we're changing that, those characteristics are being used for different reasons. So primary sex characteristics, just to let you know, are different chromosomes, our sex hormones, structures, all things about reproduction. But what we're seeing evolutionary-wise is secondary sex characteristics, things about our breasts, finer skin, more subcutaneous fat, that kind of stuff. Great muscular structure for male, deep for all those kinds of things have been masculized or feminized. And you can see this in just how we do gendering within our marketing. I usually have a video, but I didn't put it on this time, about the marketing of gender and how these secondary characteristics are put into our deodorants and our scents and our soaps and our clothing. And so there's this very nature versus nurture argument about how we evolutionize our expression of our gender. Intrasexual competition is something also that we have to look at. It has been something of evolutionary theory's background to say that really what's going on is the competition between two sexes, or two people of the same sex trying to get the best female. That is so dated, but it's part of our anthropological look, originated study of opposite sex relationships. Now that we see this new gender spectrums as they present themselves in our literature and as they have been around for millennia, and yet now being identified more in the mainstream, does this type of competition for the best person or competition for somebody's love based on biological sex hold up? I'll leave that up to you. Social learning theory, in looking at our bodies and how we are coming into the world as we try to get expressions of affirmation and or sometimes we experience negativity based on how we identify, stresses the importance of learned behaviors of gender applied to biological sex characteristics. So we often get, still in this day and age, that primary role of learned behavior based on the norms of what your sex and your binary sex expects of you. And you will often experience negative reinforcement theory if you choose to alter from that norm. That once again will be something interesting to see as we continue to challenge the norms and the structures of level of the power as of what sex assigned to us at early ages. And then again, the thing, I'm so sorry, it constantly keeps going here. We have to recognize this power is at the core. Your power is important. An individual's capacity to alter the behavior and experiences of others while there's resisting influence of others, meaning you have power to basically, hopefully, have your own behavior and your own experience be your own. But there's also outside power. Sometimes those norms, that heteronormative world, is something that kind of plays into how we see and view ourselves. And so we have to recognize sometimes there's larger powers at work, but we also have to recognize the power of change and recognize our part in that. This is something that in the book, a lot of times we still see as far as comparing men and women and their understanding of what we see going on. Once again, it's not my favorite, but men and women, men are more physically, verbally abusive than women. We still see that being expressed as something that continually is where the violence is constantly seen against women as a norm. But once again, we have to be more aware of all kinds of partner violence. It's often seen that women are more skilled at expressing emotions, although I'm married to a man who is a high feeler and I'm a thinker. And so that may or may not be true, but we see that more on a norm. Once again, is that nurture or nature. Women are more likely than men to seek out emotional support, and women are more likely to feel anxious, guilty. These are interesting things. Finally, some facts about same-sex couples. In 2005, there were approximately 8.8 million gay, lesbian, and bisexual people living in the United States. I'm sure we have more that are represented based on some of the changes. So these are statistics that are over 10 years old. So I would once again be interested in what's going to go on in the next census. Not all of these people are in relationships. Same-sex couples make out about 1% of households with couples in them. And we just, in the 2000 census, started to be able to take the census counting same-sex couples. And so that's important as well. About 20% of all same-sex couples in the United States are raising children at the under the age of 18, and about 48% of married couples in the United States are raising children under 18. So that's a really big thing, is seeing that desire to still have families. And going back to evolutionary theory, that desire to have children is very strong, no matter what the type of couple. Finally, an analysis of data from the 4 states, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and California, shows about half or fewer of all same-sex couples involve 2 women. At the same time, lesbians made up about 2/3 of all same-sex couples who married or sought legal recognition for their relationship. So we are going to see these facts continue to develop. We're going to see heterosexual relationships continue to develop. We're going to see people who are not identifying as any of these categories continue to develop. But I think it's important for us to keep that lens and look at it theoretically, but also to look at it with clear wisdom. Please watch all the videos that I've supplied. Once again, the process of identifying and living into your identity is your journey. It will affect others, but in the end, it really is all about you and who you want to be. Have a good day or night. Please feel free to contact me. Sorry about my coughing fit at the end here, but once you get recording, you just got to keep going. Have a great day.